talk about the Wensleydale Royal Sheep. I'm now going to hand you over to Dr Graham Steventon, who is going to talk all about the history of the breed. So over to you.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more than the history of the breed. I'm going to talk about a little bit of history. We don't want too much history, but we do need to know a little bit about where the breed came from, how the breed got started. And it is quite an interesting history, as you'll see. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sheep and keeping sheep. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences of keeping the sheep, so it will be very much kind of related to what I've done over time. Just a little bit about me to start. As she said, I'm Graham Steventon. I'm a Wensleydale breeder. Been breeding sheep for somewhere around about approaching 30 years. So I know a little bit about them. A little bit about my background. People say to me, you're a doctor. What are you a doctor of? Are you a medical doctor? No, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a doctor by PhD. I did a PhD in sociology, and I taught at university for around about 23 years criminology. So I'm a criminologist. But I also had a background in architecture because I qualified as an architect too. So quite a varied background. So all of those things, and I breed Wensleydale sheep. And the Wensleydale sheep, even though I've changed career, Wensleydale sheep have gone throughout, so for most of that time. My wife and I started to keep Wensleydale sheep in 1988. We established our flock. None of us had a livestock background. She kept horses, but that was about it. And we kept sheep to graze where the horses didn't graze. And so in 1987, we kept a few crossbreds. And from that, we actually learned the ropes, learning how to lamb sheep, how to keep sheep, learning how to deal with particular sheep problems. And then in 1988, because we didn't really want to produce lambs for slaughter, we thought we would establish a rare breed flock. And we looked at Wensleydales, and when you actually see sheep that are in this photograph, it's very difficult not to fall in love with them. And so we decided Wensleydales would be the breed that we kept. So in 1988, we bought a ram and 2 ewes, and that was the foundation of our flock. And gradually over time, as the crossbreds died out, we bought more Wensleydales. We produced Wensleydale lambs, we kept the Wensleydale lambs, and we increased the flock. Now, it's important to realise that people buy into Wensleydale sheep, and they like to go and show them, as we did. And you buy a nice sheep at a show, or at a sale, and then you take it to a show and you show it. But if you want to actually really do well at show, you've got to produce your own sheep. It's what you produce. And it's the only way that you can actually test how good your sheep are, by putting them alongside others. And so we set about doing that, and over the years we showed at lots of big shows, and we did pretty well at it. We won 3 times at the Great Yorkshire. We won, I think it was a couple of times at the Royal Show when that was still going, and lots of other successes too. And having had a break over COVID and a little bit before COVID, we got back into showing last year, and we got the champion at the 3 Counties show of Wensleydale. They showed Wensleydales for the first time, and we got champion for that. And then this year, this last autumn, at Melbourne Show and Sale, we won Reserve Interbreed with a ram. So we haven't lost the touch. We've been doing it a long time and kind of have learned how to do it fairly successfully. But we look at that particular photo and we see what we think of when we think about Wensleydale sheep. We are naturally drawn to a yearling ewing wool. And they are really magnificent creatures, particularly when they're clean. They're well-wooled and they're looking very tidy. And particularly you put a group of them together in a show ring and they really do look magnificent. We'll see some photos of that at the end. We need to remember though that there was a time when these sheep really did fall down in numbers and there was a danger that they went into extinction. So it's really gratifying to see so many people here today that are interested in the breed, enough to want to come and hear me talk about it. When Jodie asked me if I would do the talk, I think she was hunting around for someone to do this, and she asked me if I would do the talk, and I'll let you know. And then I thought, I probably will, yes, I'll do it. Thinking that we were looking at about a dozen people, so I thought it'd be, just a few. And as time went on, the numbers grew and grew and grew, and I thought it's going to be like a big lecture hall. But anyway, it's really nice to see so many faces, and because I've lectured for a number of years, and so quite used to actually talking in front of an audience. Don't forget, students are a different animal altogether because you don't see smiling faces. They're usually looking at their phones. They're there because they have to be there, not because they want to be there. So it's nice to see everybody here looking like they want to be here. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is really talk through a little bit of history. We need to understand where the breed came from. So let me just move that on. So we're going to do that by looking at what I call key moments. That's a sociological term, by the way. Key moments or key points in history that we really want to be interested in. And the thing that's, I think, most interesting about Wensleydale's is that they have a very unique history. You look back and you're looking at the foundation of breed from one breeder, one ram, in 1 year. And I think probably probably all breeds that you look at can't track back to that very, very kind of specific point in time. Now, of course, that's a very simplistic view. It's real, it happened, but it's very simplistic to think that Wensleydales were created simply out of one ram. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the context before that, because we need to understand all of the things that came together at a point in time in history to give us that 1 year, one breeder, one ram. So when we think about sheep breeds in the UK, we can go back to Roman times. We're not really interested in Roman times, but Romans were, I think, probably key in bringing in long-wool sheep into the country. So they weren't indigenous sheep, and so Romans brought long-wool sheep into the country, and those sheep then became established over time. And we're more interested in what we might call the Midland long-wools, which were around, and we're looking at the forerunners to breeds like the Cotswolds, the Lincolns and the Leicesters, for example. And Wensleydales are a little bit further down the road to that, but they all sit in the background. What we're really interested in is we go back to the late 18th century and we're looking at the Leicester breed, because the Leicester sheep were very prominent in the production of the Wensleydale. So we're looking at Robert Bakewell, who bred Leicester sheep, very famous Leicester breeder. And he had a flock called the Dishley flock, and they were just outside Loughborough in Leicestershire. And Robert Bakewell did selective breeding, so he was, what he would do is he would pick out the very, very best animals in his flock, and then keep breeding from those and weeding out the rubbish, so that you had a very, very kind of very much improved flock of Leicester sheep. And at the same time, we need to look at, prior to that, up to around about the middle of the 19th century, we have this type of sheep, and I'll say type of sheep rather than breed of sheep, because these were not recognised so much as a breed of sheep. And these were known as mugs, M-U-G-S or M-U-G-G-S, two types of spelling. And these were a type of Teeswater sheep, so very much related to the Teeswater, and they occupied the banks of the Tees from the northeast down into North Yorkshire, and they became kind of endemic in that area. Now, we need to also put this into the context of the Industrial Revolution, because at that time in history, there were great changes took place. So we know that agricultural rural populations moved into the cities to work in the new kind of inventions. So certainly with textile production, they were working with all of the new inventions. And that allowed for a certain level of mass production. Now, with the kind of burgeoning kind of urban populations, then they needed to be fed and they needed to be clothed and so on. So there was a great demand for sheep that were going to produce meat and were going to produce wool. And so these mugs were fulfilling, in the north of England, they were fulfilling that role. And what they were doing was they were using the sires of mugs to go up north into Scotland to produce crossbred ewes that would produce fat lambs for the table. There was one problem with mugs. They had faults. They weren't an improved breed. They had particular faults. They were very weak in the chest. So they were big sheep. They had a reasonable length of wool, but conformation, they were very poor. And so in order to kind of improve that, what they decided to do was to start to bring the mugs together with the improved Leicesters. And that was where things started to get interesting, because what we had was a point in time, 1837 specifically, where this chap called Sunley of Kirby Moorside produced the product of a Leicester ram on a mug ewe, which had a very blue head, and he called it Blue Cap. Now, we make the mistake of thinking that this was Blue Cap. We talk about the foundation of the Wensleydale breed coming from Blue Cap, which he did, but this wasn't the Blue Cap. This was a Leicester produce. And actually what happened was, we need to move on beyond that, because 1839 is that year when we see as being the foundation of the breed. And this chap, Richard Outhwaite, loaned Blue Cap, Sunley's Blue Cap, and put onto his own mug ewes. And he had a very fine flock of mug ewes, and out of that he got this one very special ram, reckoned to be, in his two-shear state, one of the biggest, most finest of rams in the north of England at that time. And he also called him Blue Cap, so it gets a little bit confusing about which Blue Cap's which. But it's son of Blue Cap really that we're interested in the creation of the Wensleydale breed. So we get a blue-headed sheep, which at that time was very unique, and a very big sheep, long wool, lustrous wool, and seeing all the attributes of the Wensleydale breed that we see today. So 1839 is the time when we see the Wensleydale breed being founded. Okay, that's courtesy of Agnes, who's in the audience. That is an etching of Outhwaite's blue cap. You can't really tell from that photograph at that size, but when if you were able to put a measure next to him, you'd see just how big this animal was. Okay, so from then on into the back end of the 19th century, we see the breed starting to be established, because Outhwaite loaned his run out to other breeders, and they bred from, and they started to create a type that began to look like a breed. And at this stage in time, they didn't know what to call it. They called the breed the Mug. So maintaining that name, the Mug, but it was in when the first Great Yorkshire Show classes were laid on for Wensleydales, or Mugs as they were called, and they said, we can't have a name Mug, it's not a very attractive name. We want something a little bit more, sexy. So one of the breeders came up with the name Wensleydale. And of course, we're in Wensleydale, it seemed very appropriate. So 1876, the breed was named, but at that stage, we still didn't have an association. So we move on then to thinking about creating this breeding types that established the breed over probably about 20 years, 30 years or so. And then in 1890, they decided that they needed to formalise it through the establishment of a breed association. But there was a problem with looking at the provenance of all the sheep that had been bred over time. And there was a little bit of dispute about bloodlines and so on. And so the breeders split into two, and they formed their own associations. So we had what became known as the Blueface Society, longer name, but I've shortened it, it's being easier to say. And we have the Wensleydale Longwool Association. And these ran in parallel for a number of years, up until it was 1919 when they started to talk about amalgamation, because having two societies was actually counterproductive in promoting the breed. They needed a unified approach. And so that in 1919 they talked about amalgamation, and in 1920 the first amalgamated flock book was produced. And it became the Wensleydale Longwool Sheep Breeders Association, which we know today. So the rest is history, as they say. So that's a look at the key moments. Now we're not talking about beyond that, but the other key moment I think is important to talk about is over the early part of the 20th century, of course we had the two world wars, which the breeds survived through all of that, and I think a lot of the breeders survived through all of that. And everything was fine, the breed was growing, the interest in the breed continued, and then it got to the 1960s and there was a downturn. And it got down to, we were looking through some flock books last night, and around about 1967, 68, there were only 18 flock registrations in those 2 years. And I think there was a great danger that the breed would simply die out. There were a group of dedicated breeders, and Agnes in the audience was secretary and treasurer at that time, and they kept the breed going, and gradually it picked up. Now, by the time we came in 1988, I think the membership was getting up towards the 200 mark, and it surpassed the 200 mark over leading up to the millennium. It's dropped back a little bit again now because don't forget this pendulum swings back and forth according to what's going on in wider society. And we know that we look at what's happening now and we see the threats that we get from diseases that come in and get established here. We see the threats that come from political views, politicians wanting to build on fields rather than actually graze sheep on fields and these sorts of things. And so that always has an impact. But one thing that I think has continued throughout is always a group of dedicated breeders that will not let this go and will keep it going. So that's all I want to say about the history of the breed. What I want to do is move on to a little bit about the breed as it is now. So, looking at some characteristics of the sheep, it's important to think, how do we define what a Wensleydale is? First thing is to say about size. Wensleydales are big sheep. They are probably one of, if not the biggest, probably it's certainly fair to say one of the biggest traditional breeds in the UK. You look at a well-grown two-shear ram, so 2-year-old ram, can weigh around about 150 kilos. Now, when you think that I weigh about 70 kilos, so that's over twice my weight. So you might think, how on earth do you handle something of that size and of that kind of bulk? Well, when we look at the ewes probably around about 100 kilos. I mean, we've had ewes up to 120 kilos. You know, you feed them well and they put on weight, and they will exceed 100 kilos. But usually, as an average, 150 kilos for a ram, 100 kilos for a ewe. They are big sheep to handle. But they are generally quite docile sheep. They're usually quite good to handle. And the more that you handle them, the more used to you they are. They tend to be, quite amenable to being handled. Of course, we feed our sheep. Big sheep you need to feed because otherwise you've got a big frame and not much on it. And if you want to show them, you've got to have a fit sheep. So we tend to feed them right the way through, from lambs right through. And when you've got a group of Wensleydales at the trough, the cartoon, I like to draw cartoons, so I'm the Wensleydale cartoonist. And that shows the danger that you have. And in actual fact, it's quite interesting because my wife bought me one of these Apple Watches for Christmas. And these are so clever that they do all sorts of things. And they will even, if you have an accident, they will dial up emergency services. And one morning I'm feeding the sheep, and of course that's what I get. But they're in an enclosed space because we've got them in, and I'm trying to get the feed in the trough, and they just barge in and they don't care. You know, docility goes out the window, and you get beaten about. And I must have got knocked a little bit, and the next thing is I see my watch is doing something, and I think it's dialing the emergency services. I can stop that quickly. Anyway, so yes, docile sheep, but of course, any sheep, if it's being fed, they tend to take on a life of their own. So conformation and in terms of skin colour and fleece, these are all unique to the Wensleydale. The conformation, we're looking at a big sheep, but it needs to be a square sheep, it needs to stand well on its legs, it needs to be up on its back pasterns. When we bought our first ram, he was down on his pasterns. We didn't know till we took him to the first show. We knew nothing about it. And we stood bottom of the line, and someone pointed out, well, he is down on his pasterns. He was a good ram otherwise. So we had to set about dealing with that. So we needed to buy a ram that was good on this customs, breed that out. But one of the big problems of breeding out a foal is that you're likely to breed one out and bring in another one. And so what we've always been keen to do is maintain the wool quality. So wool breed, although it was always classed as crossing sire, but gradually over time we've come to recognise the importance of the wool. That's why we're here today, because we're looking at a wool exhibition, an exhibition of what can be done with the wool. But we've always tried to maintain the wool quality, so once you start to lose that, then you can have very good attributes otherwise, but if you lose the quality of the wool, you've lost what it is that makes a Wensleydale. So wool quality, we're looking at a crimped or pearled fleece, so pearl in the sense of having maybe like a corkscrew, and of course in the yearling that grows very long, it grows almost to the ground. If anybody's seen the sheep out there, the ram lamb in the pen, he's got very long wool, he hasn't been clipped yet. When he's been clipped for the first time, he will never grow wool that long again, but they still grow a fair length of fleece each year. What you're looking at is that crimp or that pearl to go from the body to the end. You don't want straight wool. That's a fault. So we're looking at a very high lustre wool. So it's probably the finest lustre wool in the world. And that lustre is maintained even when you've sheared and you wash, you dye it, and it maintains the lustre. So you never use that lustrous look to the wool. And that's a great benefit, of course. It's what makes the wool unique. So we're looking at having that constant kind of staple all the way around the body. So we look around the sheep, we don't want it to be too fine one place and too broad at another. And so you look for, when you're judging the sheep, you look for those kind of attributes in the wool, and that's how you determine what a good sheep is. Skin colour, the blueness is what makes the Wensleydale unique. There are other blue sheep, of course, blue-faced Leicester, but with the Wensleydale, you're looking at a blue head and ears. You're looking potentially of blue going down the back of the sheep too. We're looking at Wensleydale having a very pert head carriage. So the picture shows the head well up, rising off the body on a fairly long neck. Should be a good head. You see Wensleydales with broad muzzle, you see Wensleydales with a fine muzzle. That's a matter of taste. I prefer a broad muzzle, so you're looking at a good solid head on the sheep. We also have a black Wensleydale. There are two genetic types, and there was a time when black sheep were just culled at birth as a fault, and then the breeders started to realise that there was a utility in the black sheep. It produced the same quality of wool, but in some very beautiful colours, and that was a desirable attribute. And so we created a separate register so that we made sure that we didn't contaminate the white register, so that people could breed white sheep true to type, knowing that they weren't necessarily going to throw black sheep, although you can't ever be sure, and sometimes we do, but then we transfer them into the black register if they produce black sheep. So we get the white Wensleydale, the black Wensleydale, and they are, I mean, there was a lot of political kind of history about that, a lot of warring and kind of discomfort and so on. And over time, we've managed to accommodate that, and everybody kind of sits happily with that particular fact. So we look at the Wensleydale. That slide shows those attributes I've talked about. So we're looking at a good head on the sheep, we're looking at good deep blue colour in the ears, on the face, on the head. We're looking at top knot. When we shear a Wensleydale, we always leave that top knot. They look very strange without it. They look, you know, maybe quite strange with it, but they look, I think, look great when they're being sheared and the top knot is maintained. You can just see along the body on that the lustre of that fleece and that curl. And when you've got a really good fleece, it's a very vibrant kind of pearled fleece. That's a yearling in full wool. That's quite an old photo. I don't know what the date of that is, but looking at it, it's probably going back to round about the war period, either just after, maybe just before. And you can see the length of wool on that sheep. That's really what we try to aim for. You see quite a lot of sheep in the showroom nowadays where the fleece doesn't get quite that sort of length. But ideally that's what you want. Down to the ground, even kind of length all the way around. And that's shorn sheep, so that would be, I'm not sure whether that was a shearling or a two-shear. Could be a two-shear sheep, that one. But again, you can see that plenty of body, nice kind of graceful neck, decent head, standing four square, so you want the legs straight, you don't want legs that are knock-kneed, turning the hocks in, cow-hocked. You want them to stand square, leg at each corner, that's what we're looking for. And of course those are attributes to sheep in general, they're not peculiar to Wensleydales, but you know, over time I've seen some pretty dreadful legs on Wensleydales, and I think we've addressed that as a breed. In terms of lands, Wensleydales are reasonably prolific. We find that generally they'll have two lambs. This year we are expecting mostly twins. We've got one set of triplets. We've got one ewe that's got a single. We like singles because they take less out of the ewe, they grow really well. But you can't do it to order, you get what you get. Generally Wensleydales are good mothers. We've had some shockers that will drop a lamb and then that's nothing to do with me, and they go. But by and large, they do make good mothers, and you can see they're very tolerant of the habits of lambs. In terms of feeding, I mentioned that we feed really from the time that lambs will start to take hard feed, we start to feed them, and we will feed them then continuously to bring them on. So the middle picture there, you can see we set up a creep. It gets to a point where we want to start feeding the ewes and we want to continue to feed the lambs. And we set up a creep with like a roll of our hurdle, and the lambs learn to go in and have their feed. When we get triplets, we will usually take a triplet off the ewe so that we'll leave two on and bottle feed the third one, because there'll always be a lamb that doesn't get much milk. And we find that bringing them on with a bottle, they come on really well. So if we've got, in this case, sometimes we might want to top a ewe up if she's not milking for some reason so well, we will top more of them up with a bottle. And so we'll get a little station set up and then they can go and feed ad lib. And that works really well. But the important thing with lambs, any lambs, but Wensleydale lambs particularly, because they are so leggy, they're so graceful, that they're just good to stand and watch. There was a poem that talked about the importance of standing and staring at these things, and it's so true. If you only ever do the work and you don't get the enjoyment out of it, then you're missing something. And so, you know, I could show loads and loads of photos of decent looking sheep, but how endearing is that? You know, how can you not fall in love with that, want to take it home with you? And more kind of lamb photos, and really kind of cheeky, they're inquisitive, and as I say, you handle them, and you find that once they become adult, you have no difficulty handling them. Get them used to being led on a halter, and then you can do anything with them. You can walk them into the trailer, you can walk them around with no difficulty. A little bit about showing and judging, because I mentioned at the beginning that we've tended to do quite a bit of showing, particularly in the earlier years. And if you're going to show Wensleydales, you really need to be hand clipping them, because machine clipping tends to create lines in the wool that actually it spoils the wool. And hand clipping, you've got more control. You clip down with the flow of the fleece, and that keeps it nice and even when it grows back. And so we hand clip. We tend to hand clip the whole flock, not because we need to, just because we prefer to do it ourselves. It's kind of for the sheep, because you can see we stand them. They're too big to turn up, certainly too big for us to turn up. And so we tie them to the gate. So my wife tends to do a lot with the shears. She does the kind of back work, and I do the holding them, pinning them down to the gate when they get awkward. So we work with shears like that. You know, it doesn't really matter whether they're double bow or single bow, but the main thing is keeping them sharp, and you clip the sheep in a particular way. You follow a particular process. She's starting at the neck and starting to clip down, clip round the brisket at the front, and then work the way down the back line. And because the Wensleydales have a natural kind of parting along the back, you can clip the fleece off in two halves. So it's really, really handy for that. And then that shows the wool coming off, bit at a time, looking very pleased with herself. Wait a minute, you haven't finished the job yet. And so you can see it coming off gradually down the shoulder, working towards the back. And there she's coming down the flank and working from that parting down. And if this sheep is just being clipped just to take the wool off, then we just clip the whole lot off in one go, which is a little bit different than when you're showing. And there she's getting further down the sheep. When we're show clipping, it's traditional to leave a little bit of fleece on to create a line along the body. Now, different people have different ideas on how to do this, because that line along the body is meant to provide a kind of a line that gives an emphasis that lengthens the body. It's an accentuation, and you can do it however you want, but a lot of breeders more recently have tended to leave a long fringe on them. I don't like to see that. I like to actually clip it. In fact, we've got Mark Elliott in the audience here, and we learned our ropes from Mark, and this was more the way I remember him doing it. And it's clipping down. You clip down to where that line starts, just above the flank, and then you take the wool off, and you're left with the belly wool hanging down. And what you do is you start to cut along the body to create a line, and then you take the wool off from underneath, and then you thin out that line until you've got it to something like that. If it's too thick, then you've got this ridge, which doesn't look right. But if it's just a hint, as the wool grows in on the body, you just get that slight thickening around the sheep, and it just gives quite a nice little accentuation. And if you're showing, it's those sorts of details that really do matter. We tended to specialise with what we call hogging wool, a yearling yearing wool. When we won at a lot of the major shows, we tended to win with this kind of sheep. That's one of our sheep from one of the years, and you can see there how she's got quite long wool, but you can see around just behind the front leg, there's that little gap there that we didn't see on the old picture. So it just varies according to the sheep. But what we tend to do, if we're looking at a hogging wool for showing, we would be looking just after Christmas, early in the year, at the quality of the wool at that time. And it's very important that it opens. It's no good having it all in knots. If it's in knots and you've got to start tearing it apart, you're better just to shear the sheep and move on to something that's got a freer fleece. And in the show ring, the first thing the judge is going to do is, when looked at, the head, ears, work down the back, looking at how much flesh it's got on its back, and then work around the wool. And in a hogging wool, you would part the fleece all the way around the body to look at the quality of the wool underneath. You should be able to see from the end to the body. And if you can't, then you're going to move on and look for something better. And of course, showing isn't new. People were showing way back before the breed was even named. People were showing their sheep. This is quite an old photograph, but you can see that these things don't change greatly. And we see a lineup of Wensleydales there. Look like a really good lineup of sheep. And so you can see that this was really what has shaped the breed as we know it today. And that's the modern day equivalent. And we're looking at something very similar, but we're looking at very leggy sheep. We're looking at good strong backlines. We're looking at nicely presented sheep, so they need to be clean, they need to be nicely clipped and so on. And this is the judge at that particular show. This was a Great Yorkshire, I can't remember which year it was, and she's working her way down and looking at the wool. So you look at the wool down the back line, and you look at the wool around the body, and you're looking for consistency, and you're looking at the quality of pearl and so on. And then, I think this is the last slide, and this, I mentioned right at the beginning, the seeing a group of Wensleydales in the show ring, when the judge gets the breeders to let them off the halters and let them run free, and they run around, and I think it's a sight that's difficult to beat when you're actually looking at the showing of sheep. So that's a good slide to kind of take away with you when you want to kind of look back on the Wensleydale as a breed. So that's all of the slides. I think what we can do now is ask it any questions, any